Just who benefits from the USAID funding? Blaze senior politics editor Chris Bedford has a very special interview from Washington, D.C. Take a look.
Our guest today is actually pretty well known to me. A special guest, my wife, Sarah Bedford, who revealed over the course of these last couple weeks that it turns out she's actually kind of an expert on USAID. She studied it in college. She wrote dozens and dozens and dozens of pages on it. She ended up giving me her thesis to read through, which was pretty heavy stuff. And one thing that really struck out to me in this whole thing, and why we're talking today, aside from the fact, of course, that I love you, darling, is that how much of USAID money, which is obviously supposed to be going abroad, is actually going to U.S. farms? Now, that makes sense in some aspects, where, of course, if you're going to buy food to send it abroad, don't be buying it from foreigners with American taxpayer money. Buy it from American farms. But since we talked about this, I've seen on left-wing Twitter and Instagram and other places increasing noise about how Trump's moves against USAID were actually hit small farms, hit mid-range farms, hit American businesses. So walk me through what this relationship is, what his point is, and is this an example of a program that actually works, or is this another disastrous American imprint?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by works, right? Does it work as intended, as written on paper? These programs like the Food for Peace program, which dates back to the 1950s, that's our biggest food assistance program in the world. Is this just meant to address food insecurity in impoverished nations? That's what we hear a lot from the left right now, right? That Trump's moves on USAID are hurting people, starving people who really need this help. So if the intention is to deliver food aid in the most efficient manner possible to the people who need it the most, then no, these programs don't work as intended, and they actually end up costing a lot more money than they would otherwise if USAID went into these local economies and bought the food assistance locally from local producers, stimulating the economies they're trying to help, and then saving a lot of money in the shipping costs and buying more expensive American crops.
So buy Haitian rice from Haitians and then give it to other Haitians?
Exactly. I mean, a great example of where U.S. food aid at times really suppressed local markets, especially in the wake of the 2010 earthquake, and made it so that the economic recovery for Haiti was a lot more difficult than it would have been otherwise, because USAID helps dump surplus American crops on these impoverished nations. So though the question is, does this help American big agricultural interests? Does this help corporate farms? The answer would be yes. The USAID programs are great price supports for these companies, a lot of which are already enjoying USDA subsidies as well. So if the intention is for this USAID program to act as an agricultural subsidy, then it's doing great, but it's not supposed to be that. It's supposed to be efficiently delivered food aid.
So what does this aid do to the economies of these local countries? I imagine a lot of these places that are starving and are starving every year, not just because of some freak event, are more agricultural societies and industrialized societies, the kind of places where it seems like you would want farmers to be able to make a living in order for that society to advance to a point where they don't need USAID anymore to be able to feed their children.
Exactly, but economic development in some of these heavily agricultural economies is just not the goal of these programs. You can make the argument that it should be, right? This aid is supposed to be a lifeline for countries as they try to develop, but that's not really what ends up happening with a lot of these programs. Food insecurity in some parts of the world has gotten worse since the U.S. started dumping surplus agricultural products abroad. It used to be that it was just a program designed to get rid of surplus, but now the U.S. government directly purchases crops at prices that are arbitrary and that help special interests in the agricultural sector. It suppresses those local markets from being able to develop. If a farmer, a rice farmer, is trying to sell his wares at the local market and is being completely undercut by free American rice, he's never going to be able to make a living. And so it creates these cycles of aid dependency that give USAID a reason to exist forever when they're, in some places, especially on the food insecurity front, making the problem they're there to solve worse.
I mean, is this something that is worked through with, seems like there's a lot of different special interests here. So, but if you're the leaders of these countries, what interactions do they have? Do they lobby for this aid? Do they get cuts of this aid? Are there warehouses filled with food that they're selling in this aid? What are some of the incentives that these countries have to accept it? Or is it just kind of that perpetual way that you see people get stuck in a dependency situation?
Well, I think the debate has gotten really simplified because everything is sort of over dramatic when Donald Trump is involved. Donald Trump, he's starving children. He's,
Easter egg rolls. Everything's
Right.
getting a screaming press conference.
That's right. Everyone's just being a drama queen over everything that's happening right now. So the debate gets really simplified, and Donald Trump is just cutting off food for starving children. But a lot of times this aid, whether it's medical aid with PEPFAR, whether it is food aid, it's also a way that the U.S. peddles soft power to increase U.S. influences in places where if the U.S. were to withdraw its presence, Russia or China or another adversarial nation could come in and grow their influence in these developing nations. And that's a totally separate debate about whether that's something America should be doing, whether that's a good use of American taxpayer dollars. I think it's getting lost in the hysteria over the immediate effects of pausing some of this aid. But there are a lot of conversations to be had about what are these tools, what do they mean for the U.S. in the foreign policy context. And Donald Trump ran on and won on a promise to stop spending taxpayer money to chase these sort of nebulous foreign policy goals. So in a lot of ways, what he's doing is consistent with that promise as well as the promise to cut government spending.
It seems like that's kind of a repeated theme of all of this. Is there's no doubt that foreign aid is a useful tool for projection of soft power, but what are we using it for? Are we using it to undermine enemies and promote allies, or are we just using it to push weird secular liberal agenda? It seems like we don't even really know exactly what we're pushing anymore. It's not as clear cut as during the Cold War, when the Third World was an actual designation for basically great power playgrounds, places that were unaligned, that we just got to pour militias and arms into and ruin and kind of make their countries awful for them. How does this affect cutting off this aid? The farmers are about to get it. I mean, the trade war with Canada has been postponed. The trade war with Mexico has been postponed. But in Trump's first administration, response tariffs on dairy, knockdowns on beef, wheat, those sorts of things were designed to hit Trump supporters in the heartland. Foreign countries look at this and they say, how are we going to hurt America? How are we going to hurt Republicans? Let's go after farmers. How is this sort of stuff going to affect farmers? Or are most of these subsidies going towards these major corporations that have gobbled up so much of the small farmers?
Well, that's typically what happens with any kind of agricultural subsidy, whether you're talking about the ones that you normally think of as an agricultural price support from USDA, or whether you're talking about USAID. But you're already seeing lawmakers from Kansas, from Minnesota, where USAID buys most of its food assistance from, making noise about how this is going to potentially impact the local communities there, because the biggest products that USAID buys, in large part because of the shelf stability of them, wheat, soybeans, sorghum, pulse products like beans, those are all grown in the Midwest largely. The agricultural products that get grown in Appalachia, like fruits and stuff like that, is not as much what USAID is buying. So yeah, there could be an impact on the economies in swing states, and that could affect Donald Trump politically. But I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these contractors that USAID is working with do tend to be the huge, massive vendors that are getting multi-million-dollar contracts with the government. Family farmers is kind of a misnomer. Many family farms are giant multi-million-dollar operations, but often it is the little guy farmer that gets locked out of any sort of government subsidy when you're having the federal government pick winners and losers in the farm industry like that.
It's always the little guy who absolutely loses out. I distinctly remember talking to ranchers in South Dakota who told me that some bureaucrats somewhere in some treaty, international trade treaty, had made it so that they couldn't put grown in the USA on their beef. And it impacted their price because the Brazilians didn't want it. They wanted to be able to ship beef to the United States and not have it compete with United States beef. And what's so shocking about that is if you go to a rich person's supermarket, like a local deli or Whole Foods, you know what farm your steak came from. There's a little description. But apparently it's just the middle class and the working class that aren't allowed to know that their beef comes from America. Fortunately, that's been kind of changed. But it's always the small guys who get hurt the most. How does this, so, these, I know you gotta go, so I'm not gonna hold you too much longer. Not gonna grill you too hard. How do these sorts of policies affect consumer prices? I mean, does that mean the price of beans is going to drop out of the market, or is it all just fake?
Well, a lot of the prices of U.S. agricultural products can be arbitrary because these subsidies are meant to sort of insulate the producers from price instability, right? So if there is a bad crop year, the concept of agricultural subsidies is supposed to keep farmers from really feeling the brunt of that price instability that comes with the unique risk to farming, because you are so dependent on things outside of your control as a producer, like disease in livestock and plants, or weather, water patterns, things like that. So the subsidies are meant to sort of control for some of those price fluctuations that you'd see from acts of God. But as we've seen from the inflation that since the pandemic, subsidies can't erase all of that instability. And so it could affect the prices if all of these contracts with USAID were to disappear, but I don't think that's going to happen. You already see Secretary of State Marco Rubio talking about maintaining some of these, what he's calling essential aid programs. The Trump administration hasn't spelled out what those are, but I have a feeling with the power of the agricultural lobby and how much hysterics there are about starving children, that a lot of these food aid programs may survive the cost-cutting measures, even though they potentially shouldn't.
That is something the Trump administration is going to run up against. RFK and the sugar lobby is going to be one heck of a battle. Sarah Bedford, thank you.
Thank you, I suppose.